Today we'll be talking about how to approach ethics in patient-centered real-world studies. So the aim of today's session is to provide you with an understanding of how to navigate the complexities of ethics requirements for patient-centered research. And the key questions we'll be discussing today include whether ethics approval is needed for patient-reported outcomes research and real-world studies. If so, what materials should you submit, when, to whom? And finally, how do you go about approaching the complexities of ethics requirements when you're running a large multi-country study? I'm Emma Bagshaw. I'm Senior Medical Writer here at Vitaccess, and I'll be hosting the session. Before we get started properly, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. So today I'm joined by Sam Llewellyn and Sally Vincent. Sam is an Associate Director of Patient-Centered Research. He has managed the design and execution of many of our patient-centered research projects across a range of therapy areas, including in Charcot-Marie tooth disease, cystic fibrosis, and in peanut allergy. His core experience is in the project management of large multi-country patient-centered outcome studies. And Sally is a senior consultant who runs a number of our patient-centered research studies. She has extensive experience in various patient-focused research methodologies, both qualitative and quantitative, and she's worked across a broad range of therapy areas. So this is our agenda for the next half an hour or so. I'll begin with a brief introduction to us at Vitaccess before handing over to Sally. She will explain what ethics actually means in the context of patient-focused research. She'll go on to talk about the need for ethics approval in patient-reported outcomes research and real-world studies. Sally and Sam will then both delve into the process of making an ethics submission, considering what goes into it, when the submission should be made, and to whom. We'll then hand back to Sally, who will discuss how to approach ethics requirements in multi-country studies. And finally, Sam will take you through some case studies, demonstrating how we've tackled ethics requirements in a few of our recent projects. At the end of the webinar, we'll have a question and answer session, so please feel free to submit your questions at any time. You should see a Q&A box in the menu panel of the webinar window, so you can submit questions there, but if we don't get a chance to answer your questions today, we'll do our best to reply to them via email as well. Okay, let's start with a little bit about us. So Vitaccess is a patient-centric research organisation, and we specialise in real-world primary data collection. So we like to work closely with our clients to design and execute research projects that put patients and their caregivers first. So the type of thing we might work on could be a cross-sectional online survey that asks caregivers about their quality of life, or it could be a long-term app-based study which collects data from patients about their experiences of living with and managing their conditions. Our key expertise is in these areas that you see on screen, so real-world evidence, analytics, HUR and market access, patient-centered outcomes, and localization. And we like to bring these functions together in a way that enables us to design and run global patient-focused studies that generate reliable, relevant data. So that is all about us for now. Before I hand you over to Sally, our first speaker, we'd really appreciate it if you could all complete a couple of brief polling questions for us so we can get a feel for everyone's existing experience around ethics. So you should see the poll appearing on screen. There's just a couple of questions there. If you're able to submit your answers in the next minute or so, we will then see what the results are in a sec. Give everyone a minute to complete that, and then my technical whiz in the background should hopefully be able to share the results. Okay, hopefully you should be seeing the results on screen now. So first question, have you ever submitted anything to an IRB or an EC before? 71% of people say yes. So it looks like our audience does have some past knowledge of ethics, which is good. And then number 2, do you and your team feel confident handling IRB or EC submissions? Yes, again, 70% of people say yes. So that's interesting. A lot of people feel pretty confident already. So hopefully we'll be able to add some value today and tell you something you didn't know, or at least give you a few new things to think about and to consider when it comes to patient-focused and real-world studies in particular. So thanks everyone for taking part in that. I will now hand you over to Sally, our first speaker, to begin our discussion. So thank you, Sally. Take it away.
Thanks, Emma, and hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So today, as Emma's already said, Sam and I will be talking about ethics. I know ethics is not necessarily the most exciting topic in the world, but it is a really important one. So we'll be talking a little bit about what ethics is to start with. Now, actually, if I asked you all what your take of ethics was, if I asked you all what is ethics, you would, whilst you know, a lot of you've got a good idea of this, what I imagine will happen is there will actually be quite a lot of different answers depending on your kind of take of this, your experience in it, and how you feel about ethics in general. And actually it's the same as if you Google this. There's lots of different ways of explaining ethics in various different ways, but this is really kind of more what we see as ethics as a very kind of top line. So just to kind of run through it from our side. So we see this really as like a set of principles that help guide behavior. What's really important is to make sure then that the participants' rights, safety, well-being is all protected and taken into consideration, and to ensure ultimately that the participants know what they're taking part in. They understand what they're actually taking part in. They understand what they're doing. They give full consent for this, which is really important. They obviously are able to choose whether they want to take part, whether they want to withdraw, whether they want to answer every question or not, and to just make sure that it's safe and it's not going to impact their well-being in general. And really importantly, actually, the process of ethics just helps to build participants' trust in us, in researchers, just to show them that actually we are taking, you know, we are thinking about them, and we've got their best interests at heart of the research, and we would only do that if we gain ethics and ensure that they are happy and comfortable taking part. Would you mind going to the next slide, please, Emma? Thank you. So just to touch on like whether actually ethics approval is needed for our types of studies, so patient reported outcomes research and real world studies. So the bottom line is yes, it's really important to get ethics in these types of studies. There are arguably some differences. It depends on the type or the classification of a study. So for example, if you've already got something that's freely available, freely out there in the public domain, like for example, you might have an already published, already published material. At that point, you've already got, you've already had the consent from the participants. You're not going back to the participants. So at that point, you may then not, you don't then technically need to go to ethics. So it's really all about what's being classified as the study, what type of study you're doing. But in general, all of our types of studies, I would say would need to go through ethical approval, and it is the right way to do it so that we ensure that it's been approved, but also that it does help the participants feel more confident in the research in general as well. There's also additional considerations to think of, like privacy and sharing of the data, and actually that's obviously that's a big bit of information that participants need to know about, like how how actually are you handling my data? What are you going to do with it? How is it going to be shared? Will it be shared? And all those questions are really important to ensure that are in information sheets, and to ensure that people sign consent forms for that. So there's those sort of additional considerations to think about as well. And ultimately, the ethical review, it does provide recommendations to ensure that actually we are upholding, we're doing everything the right way, and we're doing it ethically ultimately. It obviously helps to protect organizations, whether that's our type of organization, whether that's the sponsors, or the kind of client side. You obviously want to ensure that you're being ethical and you're not deviating from any of that. So it just helps protect everyone. It protects literally everyone. So obviously the participant, but then also everyone involved in that. And I just also wanted to point anyone to this, and actually perhaps you all already use this and you may already be familiar with it, but there is a really useful tool, which is the NHS HRA decision tool, which is, you can see it might be quite small, apologies, on your screen, but on the right hand side there's a little snippet of the tool. And this, whilst yes, it is more around NHS HRA kind of rec approval, it's actually a very useful tool to sort of see and just double check if you're in any doubt whether your research needs ethical approval. This is actually quite a nice way to actually just check and just to really just help yourself out, or whoever, to ensure that actually you do or you don't need ethical approval for the type of research. So it is something that's freely available for anyone to use, and it is quite a useful tool. So I guess I just wanted to point everyone to that in case anyone didn't know. So then moving now on to what you should submit, when and to whom. So just to sort of start this, so what's really important at this point to submit is any and all participant facing materials. So that is your information sheets, your consent forms, any advertisement that you might have for the participant. That might even be social media, it might be a flyer, basically anything that the participant sees should be that absolutely has to go to ethics. Another big one is a protocol, and in some cases this might be that you have a protocol synopsis, so a slightly smaller version of the protocol. If that's the case, you would still need to submit it. So you'd still need to submit a protocol, but I guess just to point out there that you might not have a completely full protocol. You might have the kind of more skimmed down version, which is then the protocol synopsis. That's still an important document, and it is still something that the ethics boards will want to see. And then as well as that, it's any kind of language translations. So if you're then looking at, you're doing a study that's in multiple countries, the ethics boards will all want to see language translations, and normally with that they all want to see some form of certificate. So that is then showing that whoever translated that material, so say we're talking about an information sheet at this point, they'll want to know that the person who translated that did it on that particular document that you submitted, so the exact version number, for example, the exact date, and that it is exactly how that document is. So it's basically a way to sort of prove, if you like, that document is the same it's the document that you can see in English, and it's also the document in Spanish, for example, and they are they're kind of certified that all that information is in that translated document. Sam, is there anything that you want to add to this from your experience on what to submit?
I don't think so. I guess just on the point you were saying, Sally, about the availability of a full protocol versus like a synopsis as well, it might be, and we found this as well, that typically we're designing these studies, maybe we're using like a sponsor's protocol template and it's quite lengthy or detailed, and rightfully so. It's that's the opportunity to sort of make all of these decisions around data storage and retention of records, all of that sort of stuff. But in terms of what an IRB or an ethics committee, so some of those things I've just mentioned are examples of things that they would need to see, but not everything in, you know, these very long, detailed protocols are necessarily needed by, and I'm thinking of IRBs in particular, in order for them to make a you know, a review and recommendation in terms of ethical approval. So quite typically, and you know, these groups are quite receptive to this, but you know, talking to them about what they need to know about a study. And so it might be that, sort of, as you say, a whole protocol is being developed using an existing detailed template, but actually if you can create a synopsis from this quite quickly, you know, picking out the bits that the IRB or the ethics committee need to know, and everything else is, you know, potentially ignored as part of their review, then that's another way to go about that as well, and just kind of I guess would contribute to a quicker review as well. I guess thinking about timelines as well, if you're sort of expecting them to go through a 40-page document, say, then you know, you're not going to expect the same turnaround time as a, you know, what they need to review document, which might just be a couple of pages long, and then everything else, as you said, like supplementary participant facing materials would be reviewed either way, regardless of length. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Sam. And then just to cover briefly when you would submit these documents, it's really important to submit these prior to any screening activities. So before you do anything, it's really important to submit and get your ethical approval before you then actually start screening participants for the study. And then to whom, it really depends on where exactly your like where your study like falls. So for example, if you've got multi-country study, this might vary slightly. So you might be submitting to a central or local ethics committee. It might be an IRB, as Sam was talking about. It might be that it's just in the UK and maybe you're using NHS sites, for example. Then you would go through a research ethics committee. You might be in a different country, therefore it might be more kind of local ethics committees in that particular country. And this is actually something that we'll be covering in a bit more detail when we get to the case studies. So Sam will be covering a bit more about that. But it really depends on where, like what countries that your particular study is looking into. But we will be covering that in a bit more detail, as I said.
Sally, would you mind? I've just noticed there's a couple of questions coming in the Q&A that I think now might be a good time to address them, because it's one of them in particular speaks to what you've just been saying there. Yep. If the planned research isn't going to take part in an NHS site, but say it's in the UK, is it appropriate for an NHS rec to be the one doing the review, or should it be somewhere different? Do you know?
So if it's, would you mind repeating the question?
So say if we were doing research in the UK, so like the NHS being the healthcare system in the UK, mm-hmm. would it be appropriate to submit to the NHS rec for ethics review if the research weren't being conducted at NHS sites? So say we're doing a community recruited project in the UK, where would you submit for that?
So for that, you would typically submit actually to an IRB. The reason for that is that what would happen if you submitted that to the NHS rec and you weren't going into NHS sites, then they would say they didn't need to review it, that they're at that point that they are essentially saying that the research that they want to be reviewing is then more around NHS when you've got NHS sites. So at that point, what we would typically do is we would submit to an IRB. There's lots of IRBs out there, and I guess what might seem strange is that these IRBs, or a lot of these IRBs, are based in America, based in the US, but they can review research, or at least some of them can review research that's only specific to the UK, and then these are the ones that would review it if it was a UK study, but that it didn't have NHS sites. So hopefully that answers your questions, but basically you would go through an IRB.
That makes sense. And in terms of picking an IRB, someone's just asked about that. Presumably you can approach an IRB and ask them if they'll cover research in a different country, if it's appropriate, before you actually do your submission. So you can evaluate the IRBs based on that preliminary discussion.
Yes, definitely. So exactly that. I would definitely recommend reaching out to an IRB first to see if they would even review that type of research, for example. In some cases, IRBs, at least in kind of our experience, that they have jurisdictions in certain places. So they might only be able to review work that's in their area. So it might be a specific part of the US even, or it might even be that they are based in Canada and they can only review something then where if that study's in Canada or in that particular area. And so it is really important to just check that actually they will review the work. There is definitely IRBs out there. We have used several of them, but it is really important to check. That would be my main thing, to just, they're very happy to have that conversation, either like via email or on the phone. I've had many conversations with many of the different IRBs out there to try and work out you know, who does what, and like you know, whether we could submit certain materials and certain projects to them. Is there anything to add to that, Sam, that I haven't already said?
No, I don't think so. And yeah, we'll be touching a bit, I guess, on that of sort of who you would go to for research in multi-countries in one of the case studies that we've got coming up. So hopefully I can talk a bit more to that in a bit.
Cool. Sounds good. Right. Would you like me to move on the slide then?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. Right. There you go.
Lovely, thank you. So I just thought we'd spend, so me and Sam thought we would spend a couple of minutes just talking about how we would deal with amendments to materials. So this is, you don't always have to submit amendments, and what I mean by that is you might have a short-term study and you just don't have any amendments to the studies. What would, if it was a longer-term study, so if it was a longitudinal study, it is typical to need an amendment at some point down the line because something ultimately will change or might change. And so this is probably where I'd see more amendments to ethics. But what I thought would be useful is to sort of go through, I guess, our experience. Sam, jump in at any point, but this is really some examples of types of changes to the documents where we would say that this needs to go back to the ethics board for an amendment. And so these are things like any major changes to the wording. So this is when a change, what I mean by major here is, I mean a change to the wording which substantially changes the question to a completely different question, basically, or changes something so that the participant is doing something else. So therefore, it could impact on them, and as a result, that would absolutely have to go back to the ethics board for review. If there's any changes to the inclusion or exclusion criteria, like for example, something was being added, and it's probably that in more specifically. So if there was some inclusion or exclusion criteria that you felt actually, having done the study for a year, actually you needed to add something, for example, then you would want to go back to the ethics board to ensure that that is incorporated in, and that the ethics board are then happy. Another thing is like for any participant facing materials, so you might have changes to the consent statements. This is obviously this would be a big thing, in that you don't want to just change the wording on a consent form and then give it back to the participant. You would need to go back to ethics, and actually if something like that changes, you would ultimately need to reconsent that participant because their consent has then changed. So that would often be what would happen in that sort of scenario. There's also smaller things, I guess, but would still need to go back to an ethics board. So for example, if your chief investigator changed, they left, let's say for example, the chief investigator was at a particular site in the NHS, and then they left, or they didn't want to take part anymore, or for whatever reason, and that then changed to someone else, that would need to go back through ethics because they would need to know who's then the chief investigator at that point. And likewise, if we suddenly stopped the study for any reason, or we had to pause the study, this is something that you would need to let the ethics boards know, regardless of which ethics board you're going to do. You basically need to let them know that this study has been paused for whatever reason, and when the planned restart date is, if you've got one. Obviously, if you don't, you can let them know at a later point, but generally speaking, you would need to inform them of this. Sam, have you got anything to add here from your experience?
I guess just to give an example then of, and this isn't to say like this is the definitive answer to this. You know, what we're offering here is our recommendations based on years of experience dealing with these types of studies and the ethical approval side of things. But it's, you know, just to give an example of what might constitute an amendment and what might not is just, yeah, sort of in your participant facing materials row, Sally, that you were just talking to. So we were discussing this on a study recently that we were conducting, where we're actually doing a Delphi panel where we have developed a questionnaire, and the plan is after an initial period of review of this questionnaire, we will, so at the point that we're discussing the questionnaire with participants, even if in this case these are clinical experts, we've decided to put this through ethical approval. So things have been ethically approved at that point. Actually, then when it comes to reviewing the questionnaire, as Sally's just said, if we're adding questions to the questionnaire, you know, definitely our recommendation is that these new questions within the context of the questionnaire should be reviewed by an IRB or an ethics committee. But actually, if what we've done is, you know, minor changes to wording, you know, fixing typos, and actually, even if it was, I guess it would depend on how much you're taking out. But, you know, if you're removing a question that's previously been included in the review, then, you know, as a project team, most likely with input from the study sponsor, you know, you would make that call of whether that needs to go through IRB review in terms of the removal. So I know that in the past, you know, we've discussed with ECs, either sort of national ones or an IRB, say, that's covering ethical approval on a study for multiple countries, and, you know, had those discussions with them about, you know, we've made these small tweaks to the questionnaire, we've removed questions, you know, do we need to do an amendment? And, you know, a lot of the time for something like that, it would come back and the answer would be no. So I guess, you know, just giving that, you know, the flip side there. So what, you know, what we've got on the slider where we recommend submitting amendments, but obviously there's kind of the flip side, which is that the opposite of what's described on these slides, I guess, don't necessarily need to be submitted. But again, you know, to summarize that point, it's more, you know, a call should really be made by the project team with consultation from the IRB ethics committee if you feel it's needed. But yeah, typically, you know, what we've got here on the slide is our recommendations for what would definitely constitute an amendment, and everything else, you know, outside of this would just need to be considered and potentially not submitted as an amendment in isolation. But again, if you were adding loads of questions and removing other questions, then you would submit a track change document which shows the additional ones and also the removed ones. So the removed questions would be seen at the same time. That's it from me.
Thanks, Sam. If we can move on to the next slide, Emma, thank you. So the next, so this slide is really about a brief sort of mention and discussion, and it will be a bit clearer also in the case studies that Sam's going to present after this slide, but really about how to navigate the complexities of ethical approval for multi-country studies. So I guess here I just wanted to flag that obviously variations exist across different countries. So it will always depend on which country you are conducting the research in, and it will, in terms of like the kind of ethical approval process, it can vary quite significantly from one country to another. So it might be much quicker to get certain countries approved than others. So one of the biggest things I would also say here is that you can stagger ethical approval as well. So you might even be able to start in some countries before you start in other countries. And this will also become clearer in some of our case studies, but it doesn't mean that you have to necessarily wait for every single country to be approved before you can start your research. As long as you are, obviously, you've got ethical approval in that particular country to start, then you can stagger that. And it's something that we do quite a lot, particularly in like longitudinal studies, because actually then it does mean that we can start the research, and then if one particular country takes a bit longer to get ethical approval, then that country can just start a bit later within the research. So I guess it's just to kind of highlight that is something that happens, and to kind of just flag that is a way around it, so that you don't have to wait for months and months to gain ethical approval from absolutely all countries at the same point. But one of the big things we would say here is it is good practice, or best practice really, to involve local representatives when designing and conducting studies. So it is actually really important to do this, to ensure that actually you're even asking the right country, the right questions in the right countries. So there might be an example where the question that you would typically ask, or you could ask someone, even like a demographic question in the UK, you wouldn't or shouldn't even ask someone in France, for example. So you've got to know this. It's a good idea to kind of just involve people, local representatives, so that you can ensure that the questions you are asking are appropriate for the country where you're asking them. So I'd say that's quite a big thing to note. And another one is actually involving the patients in the design of materials, because actually what they can do is also help with providing any insights around their local language, any cultural issues as well. Like it's good to just involve everybody as early as possible in the design of actually all studies. We would always argue that you need to bring in patients, PAGs, as soon as possible, and as early on as possible. But at this point, I would definitely say that local representatives and involving patients in this is actually key. Sam, is there anything else that you would like to add on this one?
No, nothing else on this one right now. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Brilliant. So I will pass this over to Sam then to go through some case studies.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, hopefully everyone can hear me. My headset just died, so I'm just switching to the computer. Of course, yeah, we thought, you know, we'd put into context then a couple of multi-country studies then that we've conducted here, and then sort of, you know, presented the ethical approval strategy, and sort of just you know, give these as an example. So the first one we've got here was a real-world study in UK and Ireland. So materials developed in English applicable for both countries of interest to this study. What's sort of shown then in this diagram, and I'll just kind of talk to these two bits, is so using the, as well, to point out firstly that in the case of the UK and Ireland, we weren't able to submit to a central IRB that would cover both regions. So in the UK, we referred to the NHS HRA decision tool that Sally was talking about on a previous slide. Based on the design of the study, you know, not involving participants in their capacity as NHS patients or recruitment via NHS sites. So the decision tool confirmed that we didn't need to go through NHS rec. We submitted the UK, the study for ethical approval in the UK to an IRB. For Ireland, there are requirements then for, and this is the Republic of Ireland, not Northern Ireland, but for the Republic of Ireland, there's a requirement to conduct the study in Ireland to submit to a local ethics committee. So in this case, we submitted to the Irish College of General Practitioners. There are many ECs in Ireland that can be used here. So might as well mention this now in the context of the case study, but how we would decide in a case like that could be, having previously worked with an ethics committee on this type of research. And so, we have that relationship. We know that they review this type of study, and that helps with the process. Again, as Sally had mentioned before, talking to, reaching out to a few ethics committees with maybe an outline of the study and just confirming that they review this type of study and that they would review a study to be conducted in Ireland generally, not just the region that the ethics committee is in. So long story short is that we used a national EC here. What's represented in the diagram then is just to show the difference in timelines as well. So as is quite typical with an IRB, they are normally quite big organizations relative to their function. And here, in this case, we submitted to the EC for Ireland and an IRB for the UK at the same time, week one. IRBs typically take, they say with initial review, general guidance is up to 2 weeks. We've had some come back much quicker, particularly if they are IRBs that say we're doing a follow-on study linked to one that they've reviewed previously, and we've been able to explain that, or just multiple studies of a similar design that we've worked with them over the year. It's potentially a bit quicker to get those reviewed, but 2 weeks it took this one. So from the point of submission and all of the documents have been signed off with the sponsor to then being able to launch the study, starting recruitment. And in this case of this study, it was a community recruited study. We were able to start recruitment, by week 3 from finalization of materials. Ireland, on the other hand, and this isn't to then discourage anyone from exploring Ireland as a study by any means, but what we've found, and can be quite typical of local ethics committees, is that they are bound by review meetings. And I know that something similar happens in terms of meetings for a study in the UK involving the NHS REC. But in the case of this Irish committee, we submitted week 1. They will typically publish when their meetings are online, so you can try and line up your submission to match those. But in this case, we make a submission, it's not being reviewed until week 7 in the timelines on the slide. And regardless of how quick their review is, to only be able to launch recruitment in a second country on week 8 relative to the UK just kind of shows that not everything can line up the same. We could have made the call to launch recruitment in both studies at the same time, which would have meant, losing 5 weeks of recruitment in the UK while we waited for Ireland. But actually what we did on this study was a staggered approach to recruitment. And we kind of knew that up front from experience of working in, with IRBs and ECs in different countries. And, actually what's on this slide is quite a nice delay between countries of only a couple of weeks. But it's certainly been our experience before where it can take a few months from the point of submission to final approval, dealing with discussion and maybe new documents to complete and all of that sort of stuff in certain countries as well. And so it can drag on. And so I guess it's also just a case study for trying to plan a staggered approach, partly around availability and review periods for IRB's ethics as well in a study, particularly these real world studies. And then if we could just jump to the second case study, and then I think we can use the rest of the time for the Q&A. What I just wanted to give here then, and I'm not going to go into each of these and any pain points individually, but what's presented here is an ongoing study we have. So it's a global prospective real world study in a rare neuromuscular condition. And we have the study's been running for a number of years in all of these countries that we've got up on the slide now. So it's US, Canada, Japan, we've got EU5 there, Belgium, Denmark. I think that's all of them. And I guess, just to show, and we're not revealing anything that we can't hear in terms of who ethical approval is provided by. This study, there's numerous publications out now that can be downloaded from the website. But I guess, the main point of showing this was just to show how many, also sort of how many different country requirements there are. So in the case of, US, Germany, UK, and Denmark, we were able to submit to one IRB that could cover all of these regions. So again, like to talk to the UK quickly, based on the design of the study as confirmed by the NHS HRA decision tool, we know that we can submit. We don't need to go through NHS REC. So in that case, we went to Salus IRB and showed them that decision tool, and in the case of Salus IRB, they will accept, and this is sort of to what we were talking about earlier as well. With IRBs, they will typically, although you would need to confirm on an IRB by IRB basis, but they would typically accept and provide ethical approval in regions outside of where they typically are the US, as long as you can provide evidence that the country you are asking them to provide ethical approval for has no local requirements. So again, in the case of this, it's screenshots of the decision tool. And again, just quickly to talk to Sally's point then around Canada. So another example, and jot this one down as a tip if you want, but very few IRBs in the US, anyway, in our experience, will be able to provide ethical approval coverage for all provinces in Canada. And actually, we've been referred by a few IRBs over the years, and so we sort of just know to go to them now to Vitaccess IRB. So this is a Canadian IRB. In our experience, they have the greatest coverage of number of provinces, but we haven't found a single IRB that would provide coverage for all of Canada. So in the case of this study, we used Vitaccess for all regions, excluding Newfoundland and Labrador, where we went to a local ethics board for those regions. And I guess what we just wanted to mention here for this case study as well is that if there are requirements like that in a country where, a national IRB or a national EC can't provide ethical approval for all regions, it would be good to know that. And so, rationale there for reaching out to all of these committees and boards as early as possible in the design of the study, because then as you're thinking about, say, the survey questions or the eligibility criteria, it might be, in this case, if we hadn't found an ethics board that covered Newfoundland and Labrador, then we would need to exclude somehow participants based in these regions because we didn't have ethical approval. So definitely worth trying to do all of this investigation up front. We would typically do it at, proposal stage, but protocol stage, when you're kind of locking the countries in, as another good opportunity to do all of this stuff. And then, I won't go through any more, but, just to show there's a mixture here. IRBs that cover multiple countries, and then national ethics committees. So we've got here, France, Italy, Spain, these and Belgium. These are all covered by local committees as well, and an IRB for Japan. So again, Japan, another example of a country where there's requirements there for a local IRB to provide that approval, rather than an IRB, say, in the US trying to provide coverage for another country like Japan. And happy if anyone wants to get in touch afterwards to discuss this study or any of these countries, anything like that for this or the other case study, let us know.
Thanks, Sam. Sally, anything to add before we move on to the Q&A section?
No, nothing to add. Thank you. Thanks, Sam.
Right then. Let's see, we've had some questions come in already, but feel free to continue submitting questions. We don't have much time because I don't want to keep people too long. So we'll just see if there's any that cover sort of broad areas. A few people have asked for a bit more clarification on how we actually go about finding IRBs or working out what the requirements are, particularly in a place maybe that you haven't worked in before, a country where you don't already know the requirements. We've touched on it briefly about sort of approaching IRBs, seeing if they cover the country in question, the type of study. Could you elaborate a little bit more on, okay, well, you're given a country, you don't know what the requirements for that country are. Where do you start?
Yeah, I can start here and then jump in if there's anything else, Sally. So yeah, it's a good question, and we're seeing more and more, over the years of countries coming in where we, hands up, we've never done a study in that country before, and so a big hurdle for us is making sure that the study is can we appropriately conduct it in that country of interest to the sponsor, and is there someone that can provide ethical approval coverage? So especially when those are discussed up front, proposal stage, we'll start investigating. We've got a lot of resources that we've been sent over the years, say from IRBs, where there's sort of this kind of high-level documents outlining ethical approval options for different countries, on the provision that they tend to be focused on clinical trials. So sort of this PRO, real-world study space is kind of then moving into a bit of a grey area, but as a starting point, looking at what the recommendations are for clinical trial studies is a good, that's a great starting point. And so we would typically recommend trying to reach out to some of these committees, again, as I was sort of saying a bit earlier, with some kind of synopsis of the study, just to get their thoughts. Is this based on these facts about the design of the study something that you would review? If not, is there someone more appropriate that we could talk to? That sort of stuff. So that's definitely the starting point. It's not always the easiest process. Sometimes language can be a barrier, so it depends on the country. Fortunately, we've got a, as Emma was, as you were saying when you were covering the overview of the company, we're fortunate to have a localization team. So we've got access to linguists, many of which are in those countries, so can help with these communications. But to come back to that question, I think that's kind of the starting point. Going off available guidance that, say, a central IRB can provide. They're normally quite receptive to pointing you in the right direction, but needing to make those inquiries. So if interested in ethical approval coverage in some of these countries, better to start early, because that process of trying to find out who you will need to go to when it comes to the finalization of the study materials can be quite time consuming.
Thanks, Sam. Anything to add on that one, Sally?
No, I don't think anything to add at that point. At this point.
Want to hear about challenges to getting ethical approval? Are there any particular things that you can think of that are common stumbling blocks, things that might require a second round of review of the materials? Are there particular things to watch out for?
I will go. I guess one off the top of my head is certainly more common of IRBs is that they may have, say, a consent document template that they would like to use. So in the case study I gave, where we had all the materials finalized and then we submitted to the IRBs, thankfully, we've worked with that particular IRB for a number of years now, and we kind of know what they want as a minimum in any consent document that they're going to issue and stamp with their name on and let you use. But actually, as we then work with other IRBs, an important thing is asking for that consent. Do you have a consent document template? And before you've even drafted anything with your project team or with the study sponsor, referring to that and making sure that you've consulted that and incorporated that. And there's obviously challenges there where, say, a pharma or biotech sponsor might have their own consent document template that you have to use, and so there needs to be a review of the discrepancies there at the start of the project and decisions to be made there. But I see that as a bit of a challenge. I can't say it's been a huge problem from any studies I've worked on personally, but I'm aware that it can be a problem, and it is obviously one that you don't want to happen. You don't want it to get to, you know, where I gave that example of where you're looking to start recruitment in a few weeks and you've got all the materials ready and you submit them, and then they're like, oh no, you need to use our template, and you hadn't found that out beforehand. So yeah, better to ask those questions, I think. And it also goes for other study documents. They might have, you know, privacy policy templates, that sort of thing, that it's best if it's, and again, it comes back to that deciding the ethical approval strategy up front as part of the protocol design, rather than waiting until you've drafted and finalized all the materials before you start thinking about that sort of stuff, because then at protocol stage you can start reaching out, making inquiries, confirming that you're approaching the right people and that you've also got their right templates.
Thanks, Sam. There's a couple of people who've asked about particular types of studies and how we judge whether an ethics submission is needed. A couple of people have mentioned retrospective studies, particularly sort of anonymous database studies. Do you have any thoughts about how to approach those? Albeit they're not something that we focus on as much as the prospective patient-reported studies. So yeah, do you have any thoughts about that area?
Only to say, so we've managed the ethical approval side of those studies for a couple of sponsors over the years, although we've not been directly involved in the study itself. My understanding from that is that it's not necessarily required to gain ethical approval to conduct these studies, on the assumption, and you know, hopefully this would be known at the point of conducting these retrospective studies, is that the study itself that you are looking at the data for was covered by ethical approval in terms of how they were collecting data from the patients. It might be EC approval or an IRB if it was a community-based study registry, something like that. That's not to say that you couldn't also get an additional ethical approval to conduct your secondary data analysis. And again, an IRB, very quick. So in terms of the investment in terms of time and budget to get this ethical approval for a secondary data analysis, you know, it's worth it. And it sort of comes back to then, what are you doing with that secondary data analysis? If it's for a publication, then obviously, you know, in the publication you could acknowledge that the original study had ethical approval, but if you can also just say that you also had your secondary data analysis, protocol synopsis, and any materials you might be using also ethically approved as sort of a double vetting in that respect, then you know, it's worth doing. And we've found that you know, I don't see downsides of having your secondary data analysis protocol reviewed by an IRB. And I guess just on challenges for that, I guess it's questions that an IRB might have. You know, we've seen sort of exactly as I was saying, like the IRB might say, do you have consent from participants in the original study to use that? And again, challenges there that would need to, you know, that you need to overcome. You know, how much do you know about the data set that you're conducting your secondary data analysis on? You know, is there statements in there about consent has been provided for future secondary data analysis? Yeah, and you know, and that could come up in those discussions, and could be a bit a hurdle there. But I don't know if you had anything to add there, Sally.
No, nothing to add.
Thanks. I'm aware that we are approaching the hour, so I'll see if I can squeeze in one or two more, but if you're able to answer them quickly, then that'd be appreciated. Do we consider whether IRB or EC approval will be accepted for journal publications? Do journals care whether we've submitted to a certain IRB or not, or is it more just the case that it's been submitted to one and ethical approval has been granted? My understanding is that so long as it's been granted ethical approval, the particular one isn't of as much interest. Do you agree?
Yeah, I guess it would depend on the journal in terms of how much they might vet you in that respect. I guess a big part of why we would do ethical approval as well is with the end publication in mind. You know, it's just that extra validation of the authenticity and the rigor of the study that you've conducted, that you've actually, you know, prepared all these materials, and then you've had an external board look at all of these materials before you've done any data collection. And I think that can only work in your favor. Again, I don't see any downsides when it comes to the publication route. That's not to say that you have to have it. So, you know, I'll be reading a paper sometimes and I'll notice in the ethics approval statement that they've just put that, you know, the study was conducted in accordance with the Declaration of Helsinki. And my first thought is just like, oh, why didn't they just do why didn't they go for an external ethical approval? And it might be that, you know, again, similar to how we refer to the NHS decision tool, they might have used something similar and made a call as a project team that they weren't going to do an ethics submission. But, you know, it's always, and, you know, I know you're the same, Sally, but it's always our recommendation that if there's time, and typically with IRBs, they don't take that much time and it doesn't take that much budget to do it. There's no downside to doing that, and it can only work in your favor, particularly for recruitment as well, to be able to say that you've had all of these materials approved by an external board and they've confirmed things as ethical for this study as well. So
yeah, agreed.
Okay, thanks. I think that's all we've got time for in terms of questions. I'm aware that there's a few that we weren't able to get to, so we'll go through those and try and get back to people via email if you've got contact details. So we will get back to you where possible. Just one thing to say before we leave. Well, two things. The first is thank you everyone for attending, and to Sally and Sam for presenting today. The other thing was to let you know about our next webinar, which is going to be in July, and it's going to be about longitudinal real-world evidence, how to excel at generating that with a particular focus on rare diseases.